Good morning, everybody. It's hard to believe it is still morning, given how much we've already done before noon today, and we still have another half of the day and tomorrow. I feel very lucky also to follow our two amazing speakers this morning, Ella and Jasmine. And I'm going to draw a little bit from their talks this morning. I've learned so much from them, and I want to try to incorporate some of what they taught us. And in fact, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit by reading part of the story of self I just authored. So I am a geographer, as Danielle mentioned, and I'm deeply interested in how places came to be, how they shape us, and how we can transform them. As a geographer, I value having deep knowledge and a sense of connection with the place that I live. I also try to foster the values in my students and cultivate a curiosity about place and our relationships with it. So that is what brings me to this work. This is a perfect segue from Jasmine's talk. We talked about our own stories, our stories of self, and I want to pivot a little bit to talk about how our stories emerge in places and how we can tell those stories in conversation with others, intergenerational conversation and conversation across lines of difference. The story is only a story if you have a storyteller and an audience. Its stories are inherently interrelated and interrelational. As we get going, though, I want to take another minute just to ground ourselves. We did that in the morning, and it feels like we need to do that again. So if we could just take a deep breath in. And Justin's one step ahead of me. I'm going to ask you all, if you feel comfortable, to go ahead and close your eyes, or I'm not going to rifle through your stuff. Not my plan for coming here today. Go ahead and close your eyes. Well, you might need to open them right now if you need to find something around you. I'm going to ask you to find a physical object on or near your person. So it could be a ring, a watch, earring, maybe your water bottle. Reach out, touch that. Some physical object that you are connected with. Maybe it's something that you wear or use every day. It could be mundane things like car keys. And as you are holding that object, touching that object in some way, I want you to think about a place that reminds you of, and a person it reminds you of. Really try to visualize that person and where you are with it. Maybe it's a hike you took with that water bottle someplace. Maybe it's just that when you grab your car keys every morning and say goodbye to your spouse, your kids. Maybe it's when you got your wedding ring, or that pair of earrings you're wearing, or that watch. And I'm going to ask you a favor. I'm not going to ask you to tell me what that is. That's private. It's between you and whoever that person is. But anytime throughout the day, if you're feeling disconnected and ungrounded, disconnected from people and uncertain of where you are, you're feeling out of place, I want you to go back to that touchstone today and just re-ground yourself in that place with that person. That'll hopefully help you re-ground in this place with all of us. So go ahead and So let me share a few of the objectives of the time I have with you, and I realize I'm the person standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to do my best to make good use of this time. I want to examine digital storytelling as a tool for participatory research and design. I want to practice some deep listening and narrative interviewing, if we can get to that second part. I want to take a step back and define what we mean by storytelling, and define some of the elements of stories. And I want to gain exposure to some collaborative, place-based digital. I may not be able to get to all of this today because I want to kind of be organic and take this where we need to take it. So I'm happy to avail myself in person or online to any questions or follow-ups you have about this work. So again, a perfect follow-up from Jasmine, who really set us up nicely for this. I want to go back to this notion of active listening and deep listening. This is a skill that takes a lot of time to cultivate. And I shared Shell's experience of, as I was listening to her narrative and she was listening to mine, of having so many points of connection that I really wanted to jump in and ask my question and say, oh, that's me too. I wanted to insert myself into her story. That's fine and that's natural, right? I talked about how stories are relational. But part of deep listening and active listening is just pushing pause on that impulse. It's not getting rid of it altogether. We want to have those questions, but just pushing pause. Allowing that space for silence, and realizing that when we're bringing in our own background, our own baggage, our own history into the conversation, rather than just meeting that person where they are, where they're inserting too much of ourselves in that. So here's what we're going to do. Here with me. We're going to practice radical listening. And for our folks on Zoom, I'm going to send you back into your paired breakout rooms for this. First, let's do a little bit more definition of what radical listening is. Move this out of the way. So we're leaning into discomfort. As you were having your first conversation, maybe you were looking away, or you weren't really making eye contact, you weren't really being fully there, because it's uncomfortable to do that, especially with someone you've just met. But radical listening really requires that leaning into discomfort. It requires active listening, a term we hear a lot, but what is meant by active listening? You want to share out? But another way of asking this, what does active listening look like? Eye contact, nodding your head, nonverbal, leaning forward, right? Those nonverbal positional cues. Be observant. So it doesn't mean you're, again, not thinking of the questions you want, but just listen and hear the details. Notice the details on the person's face as well, if you can see them. It requires humility. Being aware of your own biases, that this person before you who's sharing their story, that you have biases towards the cues that you're giving them and the words that they're using. Michelle said she's a sociologist, so okay, she must be all about numbers and quantitative stuff, and so I'm going to bring all my disciplinary biases in there. Oh, and she is from Washington State, so she's probably, left coast, whatever, right? So I'm bringing in my biases rather than just hearing her, okay? And being open to the new perspectives that she's going to share with me. It also means empathy, so really seeking to understand the stories and experiences that have shaped her experience, her story. Doesn't mean that I will ever be able to understand that. It's, after all, very personal to her, and it's her experience and her story, but just being open to really trying to understand her life background. And all this means being mindful that even within an interpersonal conversation, we're still within these positions and structures that structure that conversation. We can have an organic human connection, but we can't necessarily get rid of the baggage of where we're coming from and the society that positions us in certain ways. Just being aware of that while also just trying to meet the individual face to face. And for those of you interested in the exercise we're about to do, Danielle and I use this in our classroom. It's in the field guide for equity-centered community design. So let's do this. Ready to get uncomfortable? Awesome. Well, for the longest minute of your life, you're going to pair with someone and make silent eye contact for a full minute. That is the first thing that you're going to do. And I love that I've got all these amazing timers in here. Don't worry, I'm not going to get the 10-minute one out by accident. So we're going to have silent eye contact for 1 minute. I'm going to gently ring a bell. You're going to reflectively write on what that was like for 1 minute. Okay? We're going to then just, again, telepathically decide who's going to be the speaker and who's going to be the listener. One person's going to speak uninterrupted, free stream of consciousness for 1 minute about whatever comes to your mind, whatever you want to talk about. So you have a chance to vent. It's free therapy for 1 minute. For 1 minute. And then that on a new topic, no interrupting, keep eye contact. So no questions, just listen. No interrupting. Then we're going to immediately switch. So if you were the listener, you become the speaker, and vice versa. Another minute on any topic, no interrupting, keep eye contact, and then we're going to write for 1 minute. So this whole exercise takes just 5 minutes. And then we're going to discuss. Make sure I have the right timer. Here we go. 1 minute. Is everyone ready? Does everyone have a partner or a pair? And if we're on Zoom, Folks on Zoom, I'm going to need help from our Zoom coordinators to give out the 1-minute warnings. Okay, I'll let you know when we're going to start. As folks on Zoom, if we could give our Zoom folk, we'll send them in the breakout rooms, but just tell them when, if you can use the chat function to tell them when the minutes are up.
You got it.
Okay, everyone ready? Pairs. Okay, your silent minute of eye contact starts now. One minute of reflection. Go ahead and write for 1 minute about what was that experience like for you. So Tyson, if you could let our Zoomers know, 1 minute of writing reflection. Okay, finish your last thought, and again, telepathically, or you can use your words, with your partner, decide who is going to speak first for this next phase. We've got a speaker identified. Ready to go? Okay, so this is 1 minute. Keep your eye contact. Any topic, no. And go. And welcome back, folks, from your reflective writing. I would love to just hear a little bit about that experience. It's always special for me to see that happen. So I'd love to share my observations as a viewer, but I want to hear from you all. How did that feel? What was it like doing the silent eye contact? What was it like sharing out without interruption or listening? What connections emerged? Let's start with those two first. What did it feel like? What happened? Just describe.
It was so deeply uncomfortable for me, which always surprised me because I'm such a people person, but it was weird. It was very weird. You have lovely eyes. It was very strange. And I still feel like a little weird in my body about it.
It can be very, very cool, yes.
Her gentle eyes really helped me. She had like happy eyes, if it makes sense. So it was easy to look at her. And also she had a cheerful smile. So it was easy to be focused at that. Basically, my eyes were telling me that I need to move. I need to move my eyes. It's like, even though I was looking at her and I forced myself to do it, I could feel my eyes like, so she helped me just by her body language, by her eyes. She would smile, and so that helped me, the connection even better.
us how embodied the process of listening. It's so much little beings.
Her lip kept quivering. So did mine, so we just kept going like.
And I want to acknowledge that eye contact, while it's, often uncomfortable for many of us, some of us more so than others. Some cultures, it can be considered deeply disrespectful. In most cultures, 1 minute of sustained eye contact is pretty unusual. Yet it still allows us to have this unique form of connection. Any other comments about the eye contact? Or do you have comments about what it was like just listening for a minute? Or just speaking uninterrupted for a whole minute of your life? When does that get to happen? Anyone want to talk about the talking and listening experience? Fred, did I see your hand, or were you?
Yeah, I wanted more time. It didn't seem too long. I wanted more time to follow up. But the eye contact was actually peaceful. I found it enjoyable, but I was just trying to decide whether the one eye or both eyes. The one eye, I'm not looking at both eyes. So I was having a dialogue with myself about where to focus and how to work with prompt. I was really in that small stage, checking space, but I do want to be able to now ask questions.
Right. So this is the starting point for what we hope is then an exchange. And that minute, right, that first minute feels like forever. And each subsequent minute just gets shorter and shorter. It's been a minute already. The first one felt like a year. The last one felt like it went by a second, at least in my experience. And I want to get some comments from the chat if we can. I can't see the chat though, if someone wants to share out, or unmute if you want. But other observations or comments from the crowd.
Yeah, I think for me the listening started with the silent moment because I was listening. I think I became aware of the ambient sound also, and also what the thoughts that were in my head, and that kind of got carried on to the sharing. So I think the active listening was, I think the looking in the eyes was a perfect kind of setup for that.
So that's a great segue question to the last set of questions. So we've had 2 iterations of active listening now. Have you gotten better? What was different about this one? And also, what was the point of this? How might you use this in your own context or your own practices? Any reactions to those questions?
I can definitely relate this practice with dating. Like, you're going to date someone, like, to show your intimacy and encourage more self-disclosure when closer, you're going to look into their eyes and be an active listener, and this can promote like more closeness between you and another.
Absolutely. So in your interpersonal lives, just being curious about someone else rather than thinking about what I'm going to say next to impress them, just asking questions and being there with them. Yeah.
Looking into each other's eyes almost in the act beginning, it was a bit like awkward, but gradually during the process, we kind of like based on this openness, developed into another stage of like a closeness, and that can lead to the conversation to open it up like icebreaker to other, maybe for much more comfortable. And this is like interesting experience because at the beginning you thought I couldn't last for 1 minute, it's just too long, it's weird, but gradually the dynamic kind of changed, and then you embrace this awkwardness to something else.
Great observation. And it's sort of like what happens in a group over a long period of time. And if you are in groups, this is a great icebreaker, but it's interesting to do this over time. Like as you get to know each other more, what emerges, what conversations come out of that. Wonderful observations. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions or reactions or responses?
I was really surprised that straight away, maybe because we had just come out of a really lovely conversation, but like not like this rush of like emotion. Like I felt like the It felt like this amazing kit, like to be able to just be there and like just channel full attention and comment. And like there were a couple of moments my mind wandered, and then I just felt like the quality of that just dropped. Yeah. And when I came back, just like feeling from here, like I don't know, does that happen before? So
Are we good?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, for our online participants, they had a very different experience than this being in person, right? Several of them mentioned it felt like a film, so almost a coffee filter of enthusiasm, if you will. Yeah. So having this opportunity where you can't actually look at the person's eyes, you have to look at the screen. And if you're looking at the screen and that little dot, how is that different and how different that feels? So a lot of folks online, same experience, same instructions, very different feelings when it was in Wisconsin and Michigan and all over the place where our people were coming from today. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you for sharing that out, Dyson. And both of those are wonderful observations. One is how much love and gratitude and connection we have for the people around us and the world around us that we filter. And so often it's because we've got all these screens that act as a filter and act as a block to that. And just being able to lower those screens and lower those filters every once in a while and connect with a human being is so profound. So, but how then, this is my segue, do we use digital tools, acknowledging the fact that we're in this digital world, that we do have screens around us, to facilitate these same types of human connections about experience, even through the digital world? How can we mediate the two? Because our digital technologies also provide wonderful tools for us to hear other people's stories that we can't see face to face every day. So I want to talk about how this can contribute to sharing stories together. We talked a little bit about stories so far today, and I want to take a minute just to define what do we mean by storytelling. In a lot of my classes, I like to refer to the work of Hannah Arendt, who talked a lot about the politics of narrative. And my understanding of Hannah Arendt's work is that she believes storytelling was about translating private experiences or memories, otherwise known as stories, into public meaning or narratives. This is why a lot of folks refer to storytelling as a feminist practice, because feminist politics was very much about translating private experiences of domestic abuse, of workplace harassment, into taboo subjects or things that just happens at home or that happens to everyone, that's mundane, to a narrative, a shared public narrative. This is a human rights issue, a women's rights issue, a public health issue that needs public attention. So translating those stories. Also in healthcare, right? And one of my favorite examples of this is the AIDS quilt, an example of visual storytelling. When AIDS was known as a gay man's disease and not really applicable to the American public at large. People didn't want to talk about this taboo topic. The AIDS quilt was this radical reclamation of that story and saying, look at all these individual lives that were affected by AIDS, right? That each one of these people had an individual story, and yet their stories together create a quilt, right? So it's not about subsuming that one individual unique story that just exists on its own, which obscures the broader context. It's about saying that this one story is part of a larger narrative that needs attention. So I'm just really interested in the way our own individual stories can fit with, help to create, or help to challenge these broader overarching narratives. And that's where digital storytelling can come in. So digital storytelling, again, this is now a broad category, but in general and kind of traditionally, it combines the tradition of oral storytelling with multimedia, visual and sound capabilities of digital technology. I come to this through my work as a geographer. One of my kind of early subfields within geography was geographies of children and youth. And we're very interested in using creative visual methods as a way to kind of level that, like your parent or your teacher, you need to give me the right answers, and children, right? Where interviews don't necessarily work because, well, what's the right answer? How do I tell you what you want to hear? And so kind of putting us all on the same level. And visual methods can do this very well. So photo voice might be very familiar to a lot of you. Photo diaries, photo mapping, I've used some of that in my work. Mental mapping. Mental mapping is a great way to learn about places through someone else's eyes, but also it's a practice tool that you can do alongside someone else. So rather than having that formal interview structure, instead we're just drawing, we're writing together. And tell me about what you're drawing. I'm going to tell you about what I'm drawing. And I try to do these same practices along with any of my research participants. And so my PhD research was with children and youth in refugee camps in the West Bank. And we were doing these photo diaries. Then one day, one of the girls was like, oh, there's a video function on here. Let's make videos. Let's tell stories. Let's make musalsalat, which are soap operas. And we kind of just naturally transitioned into video work. And the kids in my group started creating their own stories, either those kind of fictional ones, or kind of piecing together the images they had taken to create digital stories. So I kind of, through the back end, got into digital storytelling. Some of you might be familiar with Joe Lambert's work on digital storytelling. He comes to this through a local history, or oral history, local radio, and community theater kind of background. There's a BBC tradition of local radio stories that are seen as being a means for empowering and representing local communities through local dialects, right? The dialect in the United Kingdom, if you go 3 kilometers in any direction, the dialect completely changes, and yet the BBC has recessed pronunciation. It's the same voice. So they wanted to let local voices speak. It's increasingly being used as a tool to facilitate intercultural and intergenerational dialogue and learning. And also for mediatizing memory. So it's being connected with oral histories. Oral histories are wonderful. I'll talk about them in just a minute. But one problem is as soon as you conduct that oral history, it's transcribed, it's put in an archive. Maybe that archive has public access, maybe it doesn't. Who's going to read that except for maybe a researcher in 10 years, a PhD student 20 years from now. But if you can mediatize that oral history in some way and make it more publicly accessible, that just creates a wider audience. So oral history, though, contributes a lot of its ethos to digital storytelling, and that it's part of a way of democratizing our understanding of the past. So democratizing historical narratives through individual stories. It's also especially important with communities that have been marginalized in some way, whose voices were not considered worthy of adding to the historical record, whose written traces, either for their own self-preservation or again because they were not valued, were not recorded. So this can add so much texture to our understanding of place in the past. It's also a form of co-creation of knowledge, shared knowledge creation. It's not that I am the authoritative scholar and I'm writing this history. It's that this person is sharing their story and I'm asking the questions, and together we produce this history. And so I think digital storytelling shares that kind of co-created aspect to it. The final kind of intellectual piece that I'm drawing from here is counter storytelling in the critical race theory tradition. And I love this quote by Delgado and Stefan Kick. Powerfully written stories and narratives may begin a process of correction in our system of belief and categories by calling attention to neglected evidence and reminding readers of our common humanity. So stories are pieces of evidence, right? And everyone can connect in some way through that human experience. In geography, we have a practice called counter mapping, in which communities appropriate the state's techniques of formal mapping to make their own maps as alternatives. And so in a lot of my work with storytelling, we've mapped those stories to see how these stories attach to places and how we can begin to dismantle our understandings of those places that are often very unlike the experiences of the people in those places. So I want to show you another example of a story. This is by colleagues of mine in CUNY in New York. And this was about 10 years ago as the stop and frisk policy in New York was getting going. And so this group of geographers, sociologists, and community members started mapping where stop and frisk was happening throughout all of New York. And so this is every kind of second is a day. And the kind of flashing aspect is that at night is when there were more stop and frisks. We can kind of see the temporalities of it. And then as more and more stop and frisks happen in a particular area, it would leave a trace, and they could then correlate that with race and socioeconomic data. And it should not surprise you, of course, that lower income Black and brown communities were much more heavily policed. And so this was telling a story, a visual story. And it's a powerful one if you know these areas. But if you're not really familiar with New York, or if you don't know those communities, it's hard to give you that kind of visceral understanding of what this meant to people. So they also collected oral histories from elders, from young people, from people who were being affected by this, the kind of humiliation they were experiencing, and just the kind of everyday violence that stop and frisk meant for them, that it wasn't keeping them safe, it was victimizing them. And those stories helped to kind of provide individual data points for all of these little dots here, and helped to change the narrative around stop and frisk, which was thankfully abandoned in New York, but not elsewhere. I've also had the chance to do some of this work in Lebanon. I was working on a project looking at, I see a head shaking there. Are you familiar with Beirut?
Yeah, I am from Lebanon.
Ahlan wa sahlan. So you can tell us about, you want to tell us a little bit about Horsh Beirut?
I mean, yeah, it's kind of a place similar to like Central Park in New York or something, but it's very like to the city. It's small compared to Central Park, and it has around it symmetry. It has like also like a place for play tennis and soccer. Like it has a lot, and it brings together a lot of different people in Beirut to kind of like experiencing outdoors, etc. And its location is also very interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Lebanon, but it's a very, very small country. It's like the size is 1/14 of Lebanon. It's very small, but it has like around 18 different religious sectors. So the location of this place is like in an area that's known to be occupied a lot by like Muslim Sunnis, but at the same time, it's kind of like south side is more Muslim Shias, and it's like east side is more of Christians. So, very interesting.
Beautifully put. Wonderful, Saad. Thank you so much. So, Saad, I was working, yes, let's give some snaps on that. That's awesome. Wonderful geographic orientation for us. So I was working on a project that was looking at how young people experience belonging and citizenship in a city like Beirut, in which there's not a lot of public space, in which a lot of spaces, as you said, are heavily categorized in sectarian terms. This is a Sunni neighborhood, this is Shia neighborhood, this is Christian, this is upper class and intellectual, right? How do you find a sense of belonging or connection in that space? And so we worked with an organization called Nahnu, which in Arabic means us, and they were very interested in telling stories about the places where people do meet and understanding those places. And they had a campaign at that time to open Horsh Beirut. So Asad saying the neighborhoods, the areas around Horsh Beirut are wonderful meeting places, but for a long time, correct me if I'm wrong, the park itself, basically since the Civil War in the 1970s, was closed off to the public. And even after the peace accords in 1991, they didn't open it to the public because, oh, we don't want to let these riffraff in, people are just going to destroy it, and there's going to be fighting there. So if you were a different nationality, if you looked like me and went to Beirut, you could easily go to Horsh Beirut. But if you're actually from Beirut, if you're a Beiruti, you couldn't access that space. And there's also a lot of gentrification going on in these neighborhoods. So they wanted to preserve the histories of these communities. So these are important meeting places, and we can't just privatize these spaces and turn it into another mall. So we started collecting stories, and young people went out there. First of all, they told why I relate to this place. Then they went to another neighborhood. So, I'm Sunni, I'm going to go to this Shia neighborhood, and with my Shia friend, we're going to interview someone and hear about their story and their history with that place. And it kind of created these connections. And I'm going to play one story for you. So then we mapped all the stories we collected, both around Horsh Beirut, but also elsewhere in Beirut. And we held public screenings. And for Beirutis, this, I think, helped to, first of all, give a sense of empowerment that, oh, our neighborhoods are being represented. It also helped to reduce some barriers. I can see your story that's from a different neighborhood. It's very similar to mine. You might be going to the church and I'm going to the mosque, but wow, we had the same experience. And also, we hope that as outsiders access these stories and spaces, that image that comes to your mind of Beirut It's no longer this monolithic singular image. It's now a bunch of stories that look really different. And there's so much diversity here and individual experiences. So I'm going to play one for you. And in this process, again, young people were telling their own story, but also co-producing a story with at least one other person. But this Dima, one of our storytellers, did an amazing job, and she wanted to tell a polyvocal story about one of the few places where she gets to encounter people from other parts of the city, and that is a taxi van. If anyone has traveled to the Middle East or elsewhere, you know all about the shared taxi vans, and if you don't, you'll get a taste of it right now. Hopefully the sound's going to work. We're going to play this. Short video.
فان رقم 4 هو وسيلة مواصلات توصل من الموقف بحي السلم بالضاحية على مستشفى الجامعة الأمريكية بالحمراء ببيروت. بس اللي بخليه مميز اشياء كتير.
طريقه ظابطة من الجامعة للجامعة، يعني وصل لساكنين بالضاحية بكذا نقطة ببيروت. فيك تقولي هو مثل البساط السحري، لأنه بيوصل وين ما بده وكيف ما بده.
بيسلي، يعني بتتعرفي على حضارتنا الشعبية من الأغاني اللي بحطها، حتى بتحسيه نايت كلوب متنقل هيك حاطط نيون لايتس على الجناب، بس ناقصه هاي الديسكو بول.
الصفحة عملناها على الفيسبوك للفان بالصدفة، وتفاجأنا قد ايه العالم تفاعلت معه وكبرت الصفحة، يمكن لأنه كلنا بنحكي نفس اللغة. من أفقر المناطق والجامعة اللبنانية أرخص جامعة، بتصير تنقل طبقيا تدريجيا لتوصل على الحمراء والأيوبية، يعني الأغلى الجامعات بلبنان. وعلى فكرة خطه كان خط التماس بالحرب الأهلية لما كانت المنطقة مقسومة بين شرقية وغربية، هلا عم يجمع العالم على نفس الخط.
هو مجتمع بقلب باص بتشوفي فيه كل العالم من كل الفئات، العقليات، الأشكال والمناطق. فيك تعيش في فكرة الثقافة اللبنانية لأنه ملتقى للناس. شفرية فان رقم 4 عندهم سيكولوجيا خاصة فيهم تندرس لحالها، هاي كيف بيطاحشوا وبيكسروا على بعض وكل هالاشياء الخاصة فيهم.
الحلو انه بتطلع فيه بتحسها كأنها لعبة جانيفيكيشن فيها ليفلز لتوصل على الهدف. خردة حديد بتحمل كل أجزاء حياتنا، شغل، سهرة وظهرة. وإذا بدي أوصفه بكلمة واحدة بقول أسلوب حياة.
خدني معك تحلالي بالحمرة السكرة. خدني
that or the audience, what did you see there? What stood out to you?
When they showed the route of the bus, it was like it goes wherever it wants, whenever it wants. I'm like, that is the one thing I remember about those buses.
You can relate.
Like they go. I studied Middle Eastern politics here, and I studied in Amman, in Jordan, and so I distinctly remember like, oh yeah, I'll do the buses. The first couple of weeks I was there, and I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll just pay for taxi. It's really fun.
Other comments or reactions to the story? Yeah.
It reminds me of Cemetery in Queens, New York City, because I used to live in Queens, and it's like every 2 to 3 stops there's a different community, different immigrants, different restaurants, food and culture, and it reminds me of that because when you take 7 train from Times Square, gradually it ends in the end of Flushing in Queens, all the way you feel like a Greek, Indian, Chinese, Mexican, like you go gradually, it's like you are having a tour of the world. It's very interesting.
I love it, yes. Just think about how and where we move through cities.
I think it's a neat way for me to think about that people, it's not just people that have stories, you know, there can be things that have stories and objects that represent lots of different voices or experiences or things that people can relate to.
And places. Yet no one's experience of that place tells the whole story, so you need these different stories. So Dima went out and she interviewed the drivers of this van, of some of the passengers, and after she interviewed them, she created little transcripts, and she worked with them and said, what part of this interview do you want to read for this story? And they reread part of their story. She recorded it all and kind of pieced these stories together. And this is, just being aware of time, this is kind of the prototype of some of the types of storytelling that we're doing here in this community. So American researchers, they like to go to Lebanon, they like to go to South Africa, they like to go to Cyprus, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, name a place and talk about their problems and their divisions and everything. We got plenty of those here as well. And you may not all know about what's happening here in our own Alamance County, North Carolina, although Elon referred to some of it last night. But we have our divisions here in this city, in this part of the country, as we do in many other parts of this country. So I'm involved in an organization with Danielle, or a group of community partners and scholars here at Elon and students called the Power in Place Collaborative. And I'm going to use our Innovators Compass to tell you a little bit about that. These are some of the people involved. Bobby Ruffin works for the city of Burlington. Ginny Sellers is the executive director of the African American Cultural Arts and History Center. Vanessa Drew Branch is a professor in human service studies. You all know me and Danielle Lake. Together we formed the Power in Place Collaborative. And our vision is to examine the power-laden processes of place production, so again, how places came to be, and cultivate participatory practices of community co-creation, so coming together to transform place. So we don't have a green line in Burlington, but we still have lines of division. This is a map totally visible with our lighting here, but hopefully you can see it. Produced by the University of Richmond. It's a racial dot map in which every blue dot represents a white identified person on the census. Again, it's kind of hard to see the coloring here. Green dot is someone who identified as African American on the census, and the yellow or orangish dots are folks who identify as Hispanic on the census. This is before multiracial categories were being charted. We're in the blue dot here in Elon. That concentration, very blue, or I should say white concentration here at Elon University. This is downtown Burlington, which was home to, before Jim Crow and urban renewal in the 1960s dismantled it, home to Black Bottom, which was a black economic marketplace in central Burlington. That was, again, through a piecemeal process, dismantled. They relocated to Rawhead Street, which is in East Burlington. Webb Avenue is a 4-lane highway which was constructed to divide East and West Burlington. And the train station that had been to the side was put directly on Church Street, which was an east-west thoroughfare. It was removed to block that east-west thoroughfare to prevent cruising in the 1960s. So, design. This was by design. This didn't happen randomly. People just didn't self-segregate in these communities. It happened by design. There's also a 10-year life expectancy gap between these two sides of Burlington, which is again by design. There are many more green spaces, walking paths, etc., cycle paths on this side of Elon and Burlington than on the east side of Burlington. So part of our vision is, first of all, to start to pop some of these bubbles, to create connections, to valorize and hear the stories of communities and their rich histories, but also to surface some of these problems and tensions and think, how can we undo some of this damage that's been done by design? So, principles. This is Jane Sellers, the late founding director of the African American Cultural Arts and History Center. And one of her guiding principles was that her place matters, that East Burlington has history, that it has value, and that Rawhead Street in East Burlington might, evoke certain ideas in people's minds here in Alamance County. Those are the trouble areas, that's where police goes. Her vision and principle was that these places have value and that people's stories need to be heard. At the time, this was before their center had a physical space. They now have a physical museum. But she was running walking tours of East Burlington by herself, and she was doing pop-up exhibits all around the city in libraries. And I had just come to Elon, fresh off of doing some of this work in Beirut, and said, maybe we should do some of this in Burlington. Maybe some of those walking tours can be a digital map. Maybe some of these pop-up exhibits can be digital stories. And we set about a project. We started coming up with ideas. And our ideas were, well, let's just start by recording some oral histories. We've got students, we've got resources, we've got time. Who who do you want to interview? Whose story can we capture? And then our students came in, great comm school here at Elon. They said, we know how to run a camera. We could make visual stories. These don't just have to be oral histories. We can do this visual component together. We just started experimenting. Now, you take a lot of prominently white privileged students, and they're going to do oral histories with prominently Black elders, and there's definitely going to be a gap there, right? Things that are going to be said to someone's neighbor or family member in an oral history is very different from what is going to be said in front of this student. There's a lot of politeness. There's those screens. So as we did this work, we realized there's a lot more community building, trust, fostering of rapport that needs to be done. We need to get into each other's spaces more. Sadly, Jane passed away pretty soon after that first prototype. As we were just picking up the pieces and deciding whether or not we wanted to keep going with this project, COVID hit. How are you going to do oral histories with older folks who might have health problems? But in talking to our community partners, they said, when we're socially distanced is when we need these stories even more. We need to connect even more. So it was really hard, but Danielle and I, in this room with our students, got on Zoom, did a lot of oral histories with these communities as they were socially distancing at Mako Bigelow Center in North Park. On their screens, our students were here on their screens, and we connected and had some amazing experiences nonetheless. I've got just a little bit of time left, but I want to show one other story that's come out of this project. I mentioned North Park. North Park has been a kind of heart to this project. North Park was the Black Park in Burlington. I don't know if you've traveled around or driven through Burlington yet. There's a really beautiful city park. That was the White Park. It had a pool, and so did North Park. It had a carousel, so did North Park. Until that carousel fell apart, they took it away, never replaced it. If you go to City Park now, we've got a beautiful multi-million-dollar complex that has the white carousel. But it also has one of the horses from the North Park carousel, and it's telling that story about the North Park carousel and the hurt that taking that away had caused. But that story probably would not have been told were it not for Bobby Ruffin, who was director of North Park, part of this project, and making sure that that history was told. So I'm going to we only have a few minutes, so I'm just going to play you a portion of one of the stories we've collected by Dr. Gloria Diaz. She talks about her own upbringing in Galveston, but then she talks about how important North Park was to her in her life. So I'll play this and then we'll start to wrap up.
Because I used to come over to this park all the time. Mako would have those programs. He would feed the people. It was just a lot going on. Well, the summer program, my son went here for about 6 years. A summer program. He was here 6 years. Every summer it was a camp. They would go to, at the end, we went to Busch Garden. We went to, what's the place out? Carowinds. They went to the beach, and these were anyone who wanted to go. But I'm the type of person, it was something said to me about this park, but I don't, my son liked it and he wanted to go. So that was fine with me. Well, one lady, you know how people say things to you and they don't think you hear it? She said, "Why would you send your son over to North Park?" And I said, "Well, why wouldn't I?" I knew what she was trying to say. I said, "Well, what's wrong with North Park?" "Well, I wouldn't send my child over to North Park. All them folks over, them po-ass folks." I said, "What?" I heard it. So she was trying to tell us that Douglas was a dentist. Why would you send your child over here? But we're not those type of people. I sent him because he loved it over here. And that's why he was sent here. And there was, something about that. And I said, no, we don't do that. We don't do that. We're all in the same boat. Some of us might have a few more credit cards than the other ones, but we're all in the same boat. And that's the way you have to look at things, that we're all in the same boat. And that you don't distinguish just because you might have this or have that. We're all in the same boat. You're trying to help each other, help them to be the best that they can be. And they saw that the city park had more, but now the city has put more into North Park. And I think they started going to Fairchild. But for some reason, people, they had that perception. That's what I took from it, but I didn't have it. I thought North Park was an excellent park. Oh, I love North Park. My husband, I wish he was here really to talk. He was here before the park was built, or it just had been built. And he was here all the time. He said that's where everybody came. Over here in the African-American community, they came. But we have been, since I've been here 40 years, we always came to something over here in the park. We were always in North Park. That's what we called it then, North Park.
There. This also describes, and I think embodies, another principle that we try to use in this work, which is, and this is something that my colleague Vanessa Drew Branch always emphasizes with her students, of a strength-based or asset-based approach. Yes, we have to be aware of the harmful histories that happen here, but we want to look at these places not through a lens of victimization, but through resilience. The North Park, despite it being historically disenfranchised and underfunded, they did amazing things with the funding they were given and stayed alive, and now they're advocating for the resources they deserve and are getting those. I know we need to skip ahead, so I'm just going to leave you with a few thoughts about our co-designing process. So unlike kind of traditional digital storytelling, which definitely has its place, which is more kind of introspective, sitting and thinking about my own story, really sharing, getting feedback with others, we try to have an extrospective, place-based approach. People are going out into communities, creating relationships with people, interviewing them for their stories, and then iteratively producing a digital story together. You may have seen the classic ladder of participation. I think that's great, but it's somewhat unidirectional. It's either full control or fully kind of exploitative. I like this image from Wong, Zimmerman, and Parker. It's about, again, youth research, so adult researchers, young people, but I think young people can be community partners, it can be anyone, and it might be something that's fully under research control, or adult research control, or fully under community control, but there can be a lot of magic that happens when we get together to design a project together. Community or universities have resources, they've got students, they've got tools that can be used for community-identified research purposes. So we really try to follow this collaborative model. This kind of collaborative storytelling can look very different depending on your context and your communities. You might just start the interviewing process just as a way of eliciting stories. Right? The project might be about telling your own story, but by interviewing people, doing the active listening, you're helping to develop your story, just as Jasmine taught us to do. You might have what we do, which is oral history-driven stories, where someone conducts an oral history, transcribes it, distills that story from the oral history, and then goes back to the person who told the story and say, is this what you want to focus on? Can we use this? Do you have pictures? Gets their permission, gets their insights to see, is this just the kind of nugget of your story that you want to share? Or it can kind of be like the example we saw from Dima's story of van number 4, where people are collaboratively telling their story. Here's my piece of this, here's my perspective on this, and they're combining their stories together into one. The last thing I'll just leave you with is the importance of sharing stories. We found that the process of conducting the oral histories and producing the stories is special on its own, but in a shared space for audiences to come and watch and react to stories, and we see that they've got connections with these stories. They also remember this thing, or they saw it different, and they have a different nuance or a different take on that. And again, narratives of change, and things that we can identify as things we can work on in our society. So any project I've been involved in, we've tried to open it up for public engagement, while also having these digital receptacles. Omeka, ArcGIS, Story Maps, Night Labs, Google My Maps, these are all tools you can use to map and share stories. And since I'm just now out of time, I will leave you with this QR code. This is the Power in Place Collaborative online archive, which is an Omeka site. You can find all of our transcripts. It links to the YouTube page where all the videos are held. We're slowly building out this map of stories in North Carolina. If you've got questions, feel free to email me. Thank you all for your attention. Your exit ticket is to go get some food.